Hi, and thank you for tuning into Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Descendant. Descendant is a 2022 documentary about the past and present history of the Clotilda and Africatown. The Clotilda was a slave ship that illegally transported what's believed to be the last group of kidnapped Africans to America. After dividing the ship's human cargo among themselves, the slave traders who were involved lit the ship on fire and sank the boat to help cover up the crime. When the Civil War ended a few years later, the survivors of the Clotilda found themselves free but without the means to return to Africa. The group settled in an area of Alabama near where they first arrived and established a black settlement that would come to be called Africatown. The documentary tells the story of the survivors of the Clotilda and follows their descendants' fight to maintain control of their town and legacy when the ship's remains are finally located. I first became aware of the Clotilda and Africatown a few years ago when I was looking for a subject to write about for a Black History profile and came across a story. That gave me some insight, as here was this link between slavery, specifically those brought directly from Africa, and the present. We know that slavery existed, but in researching that story, it shortened the time distance between Black people being enslaved and the present. At the core of this was a man named Kojo Lewis, who I later learned more about in reading Zora Neale Hurston's book Barracoon, where here was this individual who was brought from Africa, captured there, brought to America, and because they were brought to America just about 5 or so years before the end of the Civil War, he had a more direct link back to Africa, could speak more directly to the experience of living in Africa, being captured there, and then coming here to live in slavery. And so it helped to shrink the time frame between slavery of the past and our present. Because when you think about it, it's really just, like 150 years or so into the past, which really isn't that long ago. I found it really interesting to watch a documentary and to see individuals speak about this oral history and tradition that had been handed down through their family, and then also kind of living within the midst of this history. That here it is, like, you can go and visit places, but here are people that actually live in this location that's like so closely tied to American history, that's so closely tied to slavery, that's so closely tied back to Africa, that it offers a rather unique perspective. All of this is believed to have come about as a result of a bet where you had this individual mayor who made a bet that he would be able to import slaves directly from Africa into America. This after the importation of slaves had been outlawed. And when you look at it, it's kind of like this thing that you see, right, the history of America being hidden in plain sight. There's a point in the documentary where one of the descendants is walking through a neighborhood. She'd always heard that like the Mayer family lived on a particular road. And so she drives to that area. Right there at the corner, there's not exactly a lot, but there's a space where there's a concrete pillar, and on it is engraved the name Mayer. It's painted in red. Granted, this is now several decades later. Development and whatnot, the landscape has changed, but she states that she's always imagined that the Mayer plantation was somewhere in this area, as here you have this street where they were said to live. There's this mark with their name on it. There's a Mayer State Park. When you look at the cross streets, there's Mayer Street, there's Timothy Street. So it's like all of these streets, the locations, they tie back to this family, tie back to this individual who was involved in the dealings with the slave ship. And it's like the same thing when you go to some other cities in the South, where you have these little things that kind of hide in plain sight, where quite often they're not pointed out as readily. But I find, especially when you take history tours, Black history tours in particular, tour guides more readily point out these things. Where, for example, you'll pass by certain buildings like the old slave mart in Charleston, the slave market in St. Augustine, Florida. In New Orleans, the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel and Esplanade Avenue in the Faubourg Marigay neighborhood, Adams Avenue in Memphis, Ellis Wright and Johnson Square in Savannah, Court Square, Commerce Street, the Riverfront, and Railroad Station in Montgomery, Alabama. Locations that function in slave pens, markets, or auction sites, and the history of which aren't as openly and readily discussed as other historic sites. Quite often, it's like things might have been built on top of them, but sometimes you can still see the footprints of these original places if you know where to look or with guidance. I always find it interesting to learn about these little hidden things from history because it's like, even if you look at it, when you go to other locations, like say when you drive through Atlanta, right? I realized this going to the zoo and then on World of Coca-Cola, like Candler. I've driven on Candler Road, realizing that it was named after a person who was like a big deal, right? Owned Coca-Cola at one point in time. And knowing the history of locations, the true history, even like, it's like the stuff that they try to hide, it gives you a different perspective on locations, right? It completely changes your perspective when you travel to places. It's one of the things that I like about traveling. It's one of the, I take a special interest in, especially since getting into like creating this content about Black history. It's something that I look out for when traveling to places. What's the history on the surface? And then what's the history when you dig deeper? So in the midst of this, you have like a bridging of the gap between history of the past and the present, right? Where they begin speaking about how in Africatown, which was known at one point in time as Plateau, I think it might still be known as that, right? Alabama. You had the descendants of the people who came over on the Clotilda, where they were living in this area. Pretty much what the people of the Clotilda ended up doing, knowing that they wouldn't be able to return to Africa because it would have been cost prohibitive for them at the end of slavery, they decided that they would just make a life for themselves as best as they could here in America. And at that time, even now in the present, part of what was needed was land. As at the time, the society was still fairly agrarian. And the way that most people supported themselves was through owning and working the land, or rather working the land, and those who did best for themselves were those who owned the land, where they could farm for themselves, they could feed themselves, have a bit of surplus, which they could then sell. With that, they acquired land. Knowing the importance of this, as much as possible, they handed down the land through generations, like to their descendants. So this is how you come into the present, where 100 and some odd years later, you have residents of the area, many of whom can directly trace their ancestry back to these people from the Clotilda. Like I said, it helps to shrink history, right? The distance between the past and us in the present, where you have these descendants of the people of the Clotilda, but you also have the descendants of the people who owned the folks from the Clotilda, right? The people who built the ship and then took ownership of the slaves that came over. So the Mears, where it's mentioned they don't openly talk about their family's past, but there's still traces of them. We see that they still own land, they still own property, there's streets and things like that named after them. They might not be living as openly as they were in the past, but they're still around. And so it's mentioned that Africatown, as unfortunately is the case for quite a few other locations, where when it comes to zoning, this was something that I read more deeply about in The Color of Law, which was about how segregated housing came about in America. This thing about zoning and how quite often Black people tend to be penned into particular areas, and these tend to be the areas where resources, so buildings and other facilities that people don't want to live around, tend to be zoned, right? If you think of like factories, trash dumps, things like that, these unsavory resources and facilities that people don't want to live next to, they tend to locate in or near Black neighborhoods. That's also the case here, where Africatown is to some degree surrounded by heavy industry, factories and the like. And it's unfortunate, as part of this, and something that I've learned about from other like podcasts and books, which I've read about, is you then have these increased rates of illnesses, so such as like cancer, respiratory illnesses, related diseases, things along those lines, as a result of people living near to these facilities that give off like hazardous, dangerous, and other noxious fumes and waste products. Some of the residents of Africatown speak about either they themselves having and recovering from cancer, or people that they know. There's a reverend or preacher, I think it is, who speaks about in the space of a year having like 15 funerals. That in and of itself isn't a problem, right? The issue isn't the frequency of people dying, but that they're pretty much dying from the same causes, right? That's more of an abnormality. That's an aberration. It's something that you should look into because it means that there's likely something else at play. If deaths are taking place, but they're varied enough where, depending on the time frame and things along that line, it might not be cause of concern. It might just be the natural distribution of death. But when you have 3, 4, however many people in a relatively short space of time dying from the same illness with similar symptoms, that should be cause of concern. One of the interview subjects points out that it's pretty interesting that here in this location where several generations ago, you had this family, the Mayers, who were involved in the importation of these human beings to America, right, to put them to work as forced laborers, as slaves, right, committing an injustice against them. Here it is that now generations later, you have the descendants on both sides still living in this area. The Mayers, their descendants still own quite a bit of property through this Chippewa real estate holding company, where they own or lease facilities and things like that to land and whatnot to factories and companies that are now causing grave and bodily harm to the people descended from the people of the Clotilda. So what's pretty interesting is you have a few different stories going on here at the same time. And I don't say stories to be dismissive because we're talking about real life, right? You had the discussion of the original people who were brought over on the Clotilda, which includes Cudjoe Lewis, right? The story that Zora Neale Hurston helped bring attention to. So through interviews back in the first half of the 1900s, and then with the release of this book, Barracoon, or rather the rediscovery of this book, Barracoon, brought attention to his life, to the area. Then you also have this more recent and modern story taking place, which is the descendants of the Clotilda, and as part of that, the efforts to find and raise the Clotilda. Even in these days and times, you still have people who deny slavery or downplay it, right? Try to misguide and misdirect about its seriousness and what exactly took place. But in finding the ship, history is what it is. You have many resources that point to the story of the Clotilda being true, but it will really just help to drive home the point, this particular story of how these individuals wound up in America if the ship was found, right? So finding the ship would kind of add some credence, would help to verify the claim specifically about this family and things that took place. Not that these families were enslaved or that they were brought to America, but the details of how they arrived in America, right? The people that played a role in that. And so as part of that, there's this effort to locate the ship. It's something that's been looked into on and off again, dating back to, I think, even into the 1800s, right? Where it might not have been the direct goal, but in surveying the waterways and whatnot, it was kind of like a hoped for byproduct of either proving or disproving the existence of the ship. And so with that, they end up bringing in like this dive survey team, some marine archaeologists and other individuals. But there's actually a journalist and like this guy who owns an auto body repair shop, and they play some role in helping to find the ship. I'm not really sure if they were the ones specifically that went into the water and found it, or if they were just there when it happened. But either way, the point is that the ship is found, and there's some questions and implications about what that now means. Number one, it pretty much proves this story that's been handed down through the generations as being fact, that indeed the story of the Clotilda was true. But then beyond that, there's also this thing of the descendants of this family, this slave-owning family. They're not like directly responsible for slavery, but they're still relatively wealthy in the present. They're still living on land that was owned by their family back then. They're still generating resources from that land. Their wealth, comfort, land holdings, and things like that they have in the present were at least in some part and degree founded on, if not influenced by their ancestors' involvement with slavery. And so in finding this ship, there's some questions to be answered. If your family has this past history, especially given that you might not be like out there in the open, but if your family played a part in this institution in the past, and now this artifact of their involvement has been found, how do you now respond to that? Or will there be any response from those quarters? In addition, there's this conversation about the residents of Africatown, their ancestors. These were like the first people from the Clotilda where they saw the value in owning land. They saw the importance in owning land. And so they purchased land. And over the years, you've had these companies encroaching on their land. There's this conversation, which you tend to find within the Black communities. In addition to zoning issues, you also have this thing of eminent domain, where in a number of locations throughout the country, Black communities that were once thriving in the 50s and 60s on into the 70s during this period of urban renewal renewal and revitalization, these various so-called rehabilitation plans where highways and streets and other developments were built in Black communities. Highways would be run through Black communities, in some instances bisecting these communities, leading to tremendous change, to tremendous downturns in these communities. One of the residents, he goes to this area that looks like a highway. It's a very busy highway, right? It's like, I think, 2 lanes on each side. But he explains that prior to the building of this roadway, this was like downtown Africatown. And so there were houses there, there was a post office, various other buildings, shops. Right there in the center of downtown is where they chose to locate this roadway, pretty much cutting the downtown area in half. Right? The downtown area in a lot of cities, that tends to be like the lifeblood, the cultural center of town. And in this specific spot, in this Black area, is where you chose to put a roadway. And it's something that you see in quite a number of other communities, where when roads and things like that are being built, for whatever reason, playing devil's advocate here, quite often, more often than not, the location for those places tends to be within Black communities. And quite often it tends to be in areas that serve as a gathering place for the community. It's something that I noticed when I visited Memphis, right? This was back in March of 2020. Driving through this city. So leaving Georgia, I cut through the northern part of Mississippi and came into Memphis through like the local road rather than the highway. And I noticed that there's like quite a number of abandoned buildings. In some areas you have like empty lots, empty buildings and whatnot. In some places, it looked like they might have began construction but stopped somewhere along the line. And then visiting one of the museums, I came to understand that this was a result of this like urban renewal and urban revitalization program that they were implementing in, I think it was like the 60s or something like that, where they took over these areas under the pretense of building whatever it was or rehabbing these places. Families would be made to move out. And the work was then left undone. So you would end up with these areas where families have been pushed out, and you now have these abandoned houses, abandoned buildings, which would result to a degree in people getting crowded into particular areas, some people moving out of the area, and it would just like upset the social fabric of the community, right? And this aided the collapse of quite a number of Black communities, right? And so you see that taking place here in Africatown as well. It's actually quite telling that a number of the members of local government, the higher echelons of society in this area, the landowners, the business owners, they've been around for some time. They can trace some of that land ownership, some of that wealth, and even some of these people's ancestry back to these people who owned slaves in like the 1800s, right? How they came to own their current property. In some regard, some of this land was owned by their family back then and just passed down through the generations. Some of it is also that their families had money or other means of wealth back then that allowed their children to purchase land, to go to school, to start careers, they started off from this foundation of wealth. And so with that, they might not be billionaires now, but they're financially comfortable. Quite a number of them are now involved in government. Quite a number of them, they certainly own property, but they also own various businesses. And so now, when you have this discovery of the Clotilda, like the mayor of the city, he has ties back to one of these older slave-owning families. He also owns quite a bit of land in Africatown, as over the years, through different means and for various reasons, as happens elsewhere in America, people have had to sell or for whatever reason. And so with that, him and some of these other interests have managed to purchase land in the area. And so what you now have is this conversation of, with the discovery of the Clotilda, what happens now? For years, these families and institutions have done everything seemingly possible to distance themselves from this history. But now with this discovery, as has occurred in other parts of the South, where museums are created and things along those lines, and, don't get me wrong, as someone that studies Black history, has an interest in Black history, I've visited some of these museums. I've gone to some of these cities, and I've seen and learned what's going on. But at the same time, there's this question to be asked of, what's the motivation behind this and who's benefiting from these things? Because quite often when you go to some of these museums, there are charges associated with patronizing them, right? There's entrance fees, ticket fees, who's benefiting from these things? So there's certainly a conversation that's to be had there. There's a real fear that if it starts to look like there might be an opportunity to make money here in Africatown, with regards to the Clotilda, whose pockets are those revenues going to go into? Who's going to take control? Who's going to have control over what happens moving forward? And so there's a lady in the documentary that caught my eye. Not that she's pessimistic. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't agree with all of her points, but she does make some valid ones, which is with her having been involved with real estate in the area and understanding how things work, she asked the questions of, if it starts looking like there might be potential to make dollars here off of the history of the Clotilda, off of the history of Africatown, while the residents are celebrating the discovery of this ship and the confirmation of these stories that had been handed down, the confirmation of this history, by the time they look up, or without taking proper action immediately, they might look up and find that much as their ancestors were stolen away from Africa, that this history as well will be stolen away from them. And so you potentially might have this thing of where the descendants of the slaveholding families have managed to hold on to that wealth and arguably build upon it, that much as their ancestors, they might now be in a position to grab onto the wealth that might be generated from creating museums and such, right? Keep that for themselves and build on it. Basically, they stole these people from Africa. They might steal their history too and use it to also generate revenue for themselves. Several years ago, I believe it was like in 2018, by chance, I happened to see something on Twitter or whatever social media website, a headline about this new museum that was opening in Montgomery, Alabama. And I decided to visit in like the opening week. It was the Equal Justice Museum and the Memorial to Lynching. And so there's some discussion about the creation of those institutions in Montgomery. I remember at the time reading articles where journalists were out in the area and they were speaking to local residents. Some residents were like, it's fine, it's history, go ahead, have the museum, it should be discussed. And then you had others who were against the creation of this museum, right? They felt that history was history. Slavery should be left in the past. It wasn't anything that we should discuss now. It's something that we should move on and move past. But as is discussed here, like in the years since the museum opened, and as a result of that, of people coming into the area to visit the museum, it's generated a lot of money, a lot of revenue for the area. The question that's then asked here is, with the discovery of the Clotilda and possibly maybe turning it into something in the future, what's that going to look like for the residents of Africatown, for the rest of Africatown? There's an event at which some of the descendants from both sides meet up with each other. So, the Foster family, who I think was like the captain of the boat, he might have built it as well, or at least he was involved, right? And some of Cudjoe's descendants, where they meet up at this event and they end up talking. They actually go out onto the water to the area where the slaves are believed to have been transferred to land, right? Where the ship is now believed to be located. They're out on a boat. And it's like the first time since the landing of these individuals that members of these two families have been at this spot at the same time. And so with that, it's like there's this older man who's a descendant of Foster. And he seems a little bit uncomfortable, right? He's somewhat apprehensive, as he explains that originally he was apprehensive about attending the event, the earlier event, because he thought that given who his ancestor was in the history, that he'd walk in and, people might be very angry with him and make him feel unwelcome, which, I could understand, because it's like, the gist of it is your ancestor did these things, you did not. So it's like you might not feel comfortable taking responsibility for it, right? You might not want to necessarily be blamed for it or to be treated badly for something that happened generations before you were born, which I completely get and understand. But then in the midst of this conversation now on the boat, it devolves, at least momentarily, into this thing of him talking about his ancestors, where I believe he says that, like, he read the book Barracoon, where Cudjoe Lewis has talked about his experience coming over on the slave ship, on the Clotilda, and his first interactions that brought them over, right? The mayor of Foster and some of these other individuals, his interactions with them and his observations of them. And so Foster's descendant points out that in the book, Cudjoe made a point of specifying that Foster treated him and the other enslaved people reasonably well. And this was different from the description that he gave of some of the other individuals he came into contact with. This is the thing that kind of gives me pause with books and projects of this nature, where I understand you not wanting to be blamed for the transgressions of your ancestors because you weren't around, right? You're not responsible for them. And you shouldn't have to, I get making amends for them, apologizing on their behalf, but it's like people can't be directly angry with you about it because you had nothing to do with it, right? You might be benefiting from it now, and that's a different conversation to be had, but it's like, we can't throw you in jail because of something your ancestors did. You're not responsible for that. But what tends to give me pause is this thing of distancing oneself by trying to either explain away or downplay the involvement of your relatives. And so what you have is like this guy latches onto this thing about, Cudjoe saying that Foster treated them decently. And it's like, sir, please. I get what you're saying. This is your ancestor, and who wants to be related to someone who owned slaves, right? Like, it's terrible. But there's this other guy, one of the Clotilda descendants, who speaks up about it, right? Growing up in the South and the stories that were told. There's another older white man who speaks about having grown up in the South and the stories that he and, kids of his generation were told, this history of the Confederacy, as it was taught to him and family members around his age, was very removed from the truth. Like he mentions, like his father and mother's ancestors owned slaves, like 100 slaves, each one of them, right? And sort of getting older and coming to the realization for himself that this history that he'd been told was inaccurate. It had been glossed over, right? It was a fictionalized version of history. And so in coming to this realization, he had to make some decisions and determinations on his own. Contrast that to this other guy who, in trying to distance himself or attempting to distance himself, not just from slavery, but from his ancestor, so he latches onto this thing of Foster having supposedly treated Cudjoe and the other enslaved people nicely. But one of the descendants actually points out, and I think he does so in an admirable way, that there would have been a reason for him to not be overly violent or hostile or what have you towards these individuals. He's going to end up owning some of them. It wouldn't do him well to mistreat them because they're going to become his property. And in addition to that, whether he treated them relatively nicely or was mean to them, the point is that he was going to assume ownership of these human beings. We can't make delineation between good or bad masters because regardless of the details, the fact is that you still own another human being. You can't be but so good owning another person. The good or bad are details and delineations that really don't matter. The fact of the matter is that you own a human being. That makes you a bad person. And so, I really respected the way that he made his point. It's something that I wish a lot of other people would look into. This kind of thing of, they weren't that bad. It's they own human beings. Don't excuse this kind of stuff. I'm not saying you have to beat yourself up or, punish yourself or anything like that, but don't make excuses for it. Don't excuse this bad behavior. You don't have to accept accountability or responsibility for, individual accountability or responsibility for someone else's wrongdoing, but don't excuse it either. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website by the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.